Well, greetings, church family. Today's daily Bible reading had us beginning the book of Esther. We were in chapters 1 and 2 of Esther, but first, a little background to this book. The key word for Esther is preservation, because what we see throughout the book, even though, fascinatingly enough, we never see God directly referenced in Esther, we certainly see that he's working behind the scenes, the Lord's providence at work as he preserves Israel, his chosen people, while they were still in Persian Babylon. The author of this book is unknown. It was most likely written after the reign of the king that's mentioned throughout the book, King Ahasuerus. So this would have been about 450 BC or so that it was written. And this book occurred, we just got done with Ezra and Nehemiah, this book occurred between the first and second waves of Jewish returnees from Babylon to Judah. So right around that Ezra chapters 6 and 7, that's when this occurs. Now, the outline for the book we get in chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 18, Esther replacing Vashti as queen of Persia. Then from chapter 2, verse 19 through chapter 7, verse 10, that's the end of chapter 7, we see Mordecai overcoming Haman, and finally, the last three chapters, 8 through 10, Israel surviving genocide. Now, right off the bat here, chapter 1, verses 1 through 9, we see that the Persian Empire was quite broad, powerful, and full of wealth. Ahasuerus was another name for Xerxes the First. He would have been the fourth ruler of the Grand Persian Empire, and he would have reigned from 486 to 465 BC. In fact, Xerxes, Ahasuerus, was the son of Darius the First and Queen Atossa. Queen Atossa was herself the daughter of Cyrus the Great, who began the Persian Empire. So when you read the name Ahasuerus, if you're a history buff, think Xerxes the First. And with an empire that stretched from ancient India, it would be modern Pakistan today, in the east, to Kush in the south, and all the land in between. It's a huge empire. Kush was the name given for northern Ethiopia, the Sudan, and southern Egypt, all put together. No wonder the king had a great and long, half a year, 180-day-long banquet in an exquisite hall fit for a mighty king. Well, chapter 1, verses 10 through 22, we see in the midst of that 180-day banquet, King Xerxes got drunk, wanted to bring out his trophy wife, Queen Vashti, bragged to his buddies about the beauty of his bride. She refuses, embarrasses the king in front of his friends, and he angrily asked his court what he should do in response. We see a lot of juvenile responses here. In fact, throughout the book, we're going to see this from the king in this case, and of course from Haman, who we'll meet in a little bit. Now, a man named Memucan, he responds by encouraging the king, make a decree shunning Vashti from your presence, and he hopes that this would impact all the women in Persia to be more respectful to their husbands. Maybe Memucan had some marital problems of his own he was trying to get the king to fix. Well, chapter 2, verses 1 through 16, Ahasuerus, a.k.a. Xerxes, gets the bright idea as he bans Vashti. He gets the bright idea of holding what amounted to an ancient royal pageant to find a new queen. And enter Esther, a.k.a. Hadassah, a Jewish woman who was being brought up by her older cousin Mordecai during the exile of the Jews in Babylon. Now, there's a question here as to what it meant that Esther had become a part of the king's harem. Each of these young ladies were taking turns with the king overnight to try and win the position of queen. And cosmetic embellishments, notice that's the name of the game. These young women are really sexually competing with one another to win the prize of the crown. Chapter 2, verses 17 through 23, we see that the Lord uses this immorality. It's amazing, God's sovereignty. He uses the immorality of King Ahasuerus to actually position the Lord's choice of queen so that he could later preserve his people. It does not mean that God condones sin. Of course, God hates sin because God himself is perfectly holy, set apart from sin. And there's no sin in him whatsoever. But what it does mean is, just like Joseph in Genesis 50, verse 20, when he tells his brothers, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That's what we're seeing here. King Ahasuerus is meaning things for immorality. He's just trying to have, all sorts of experiences with these ladies to find the one that's going to be his choice. But God's at work to make sure that he's positioning his choice of queen to protect his people. And the immediate result we see here, this little kind of aside, Mordecai hanging around the palace because, of course, his younger cousin that he's been raising as if she was his daughter is working to be a queen. He becomes the queen. Mordecai hears a plot to harm the king from some of his doorkeepers, and he tells Esther. Esther relays it to Ahasuerus to protect him. This is going to become really important in a few chapters. Well, big principle to understand is that the story of Esther cannot be set before our young women in the church as a model of virtue. Now, she certainly does prove to be courageous, willing to sacrifice herself to save her people. We have to be really careful, though, that whenever we're reading true accounts, right? Scripture is all full true accounts here. We have to be careful that what we see people doing doesn't overcome what God's direct instructions are. See, she engaged Esther in the harem of Ahasuerus. She put on external marks of beauty, used sexual appeal. All of that is far outside the boundary that the Lord established marriages to have, with all these other young ladies competing along the way. And what we see is that throughout Scripture, anytime that you have instances of polygamy, you end up with some really bad situations. The Lord created one woman for one man, Eve for Adam. God never endorsed polygamy. In fact, the examples of polygamy in Scripture consistently fraught with sin. Abram with Sarah and Hagar, Jacob with Rachel and Leah, Elkanah with Hannah and Peninnah, David with his many wives, Solomon with his hundreds of wives and concubines. And what we know is from Scripture is that all of these things the Lord isn't condoning. He's not outright saying that they're bad, but of course, what is he saying? He's saying that there should be one man, one woman. We see that teaching especially in the New Testament. Okay, so the Lord never says polygamy is a sin, and yet he only made one woman for Adam. It's clear that that's his standard. That's his standard. And all of the sinful downfall of those who have taken on other ladies in their lives that we see in Scripture just undergirds that response. Then we get to the New Testament, as I just said, we see that men who lead the church as pastors, slash shepherds, slash overseers, slash elders, that's all the same role, as well as those who serve as deacons, they must lead by example as husbands of one wife each. 1 Timothy 3, verse 2 and verse 12, Titus 1, verse 6. And we see throughout Scripture that God-fearing women are to embrace internal beauty rather than external embellishments. Proverbs 31:30, charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears Yahweh, she shall be praised. And what do we read in 1 Timothy 2, 9 through 10? Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments. In other words, not to try to gain attention from others, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness. So as we go through Esther, we're going to see some examples, certainly, of some courageous virtue in her. We have to be careful that we also show that she is indeed human. She was human, and she was definitely a sinner engaging in some pretty sinful acts, even though the Lord was using it all to place her in that position of queen. And to God be the glory. This has been the beginning of the book of Esther, chapters 1 and 2, and I hope you have a great day.